concept.
Hello, everybody. How are you tonight? Hi, Dolores. Kay, Steve Gonzo. Be-bye go Nira. Yes, indeed. Nira is bye-bye. She withdrew. She will not be in the OMB position, for sure. Terry Burke says, hiya, good people. Anyone else have tacos this Tuesday? Crunching away. Taco Tuesday. Old Gringo says, yo. Yes, Troy. And bonsoir. And comment ça va? Thank you, Troy. Evelina says, hello, one wicked witch down. Way to go. Troy says, salute. Lana says, happy Tuesday. Bonnie says, hi, everyone. And Joanne says, hi. Hello to all. We have a lot to cover tonight, so I'm immediately going to start sharing. First, I'm going to share an old post of mine. Can't remember whether I shared that before. I might have, but it's still very relevant, so even if I haven't, I'm going to share it again. This is a post, if I can find it. Oh, there it is. From way back in 2009. I'm sharing it now. It was July 30th, 2009. This was in the middle of the summer in 2009 when people were very agitated over what was happening with healthcare reform. They were hoping the stimulus bill would have been successful, but of course, it hadn't been very successful yet, and we were still in the middle of the after effects of the great crash of 2008. And so, we were just becoming aware of the fact that we were getting into plutocracy. And Huffington Post, just a few days before this was written, one Michael Brenner lamented the current display of plutocracy in Congress. And he said, "We vaunt American democracy as a stellar model for the world. The bizarre spectacle now on display in Washington as the White House and the Congress tussle over health care, quote, reform, unquote, is hardly an advertisement from our prime export product we consider to be democracy. Consider the following. The nation's entire medical system is being reshaped by 6 senators meeting behind closed doors for weeks. All we know of the proceedings is through puffs of smoke leaking under the doors." Kind of reminds us all of the election of a pope, right? With the smoke coming out of the windows. All we know of the proceedings, I'm sorry, I went through that already. The other 529 members of Congress twiddle their thumbs awaiting the conclave's outcome. The Gang of 6 composes 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats from states that cumulatively contain less than 3% of the country's population. All are more conservative than the large majority of Democrats who control 60 seats, and much more conservative than most Democratic representatives in the House. This was during the period of just a few months when the Democrats controlled 60 seats. They have just killed the public option, quote unquote, that is favored by 72% of the American public. They have also rejected out of hand the provision for financing the costs of the program via tax on the rich, as approved by the key committee in the House. So too for the employer mandate that has been at the heart of all serious proposed plans till the Gang of 6 decided otherwise. And then I said, the irony of Brenner's lament, of course, is that our democracy, American democracy, is just not very democratic when it comes to the workings of our government. That's the problem. Lack of democracy starts with the framers' specification of direct election of senators. So that was almost 11 years ago. In fact, it was more than 11 years ago. I'm sorry. It will be 12 years ago, this July 30th. It continued with the Supreme Court and lifetime terms for justices. The president was to be selected by independent electors chosen by the state legislatures. A lot of this has changed over time, but of course the Electoral College thwarted the will of the people as late as the year 2000, and the Supreme Court is still comprised of only 9 justices selected for life. And of course, since then, the Supreme Court, the Electoral College again thwarted the will of the people in 2016. Even though many democratic elements were added to the U.S. system over time, many anti-democratic elements were maintained or even added. In the legislature, the development of the seniority system and the filibuster in the Senate introduced heavy constraints on the popular will. In addition, apportionment is heavily manipulated by the state legislatures to safeguard the rural influence in Congress all through the United States at the expense of more dynamic urban and suburban interests. Of course, that's gotten even worse since then with the gerrymander that occurred after the election of the Republicans in 2011. Basically, that gerrymander is what's running the country right now. That's why things are so close in the Congress. Anyway, going on. Moreover, the creation of the Federal Reserve and its insulation from politics has led to the curious situation where the president supposedly has the responsibility for the state of the economy, yet the Federal Reserve has most often had much more influence on the economy than the president. Though now the Federal Reserve is acknowledging that it doesn't have the tools it needs to take care of the economy, that it needs the Congress and it needs the president to come in with fiscal tools to handle what the Federal Reserve now acknowledges it cannot handle. Going on. Finally, in the modern presidency, we've seen the growth of presidential power interrupted a bit by the Ford-Carter eras, but then increasing again, starting with Reagan, until the claims of unprecedented executive power accompanied by legally questionable actions we've recently seen from the Bush administration. Now, the Bush administration in its latter years was, of course, primarily focused on the international scene rather than the domestic scene, and so we saw very heavy exercise of presidential power in the foreign policy sphere. We saw the same during the Obama administration, where the same kinds of violations of international law were going on under Obama as had been the case under Reagan for the most part. And we saw the same thing happen under Trump for the most part. So in the sphere of foreign policy, there's unprecedented executive power. Well, maybe precedented a bit when you consider the executive power the president has during time of war, and specifically FDR's power in the Second World War. But this executive power has thus far been at once ultimately responsible to democratic constraints and quite capable of actually manipulating the consent of the population and the Congress in certain areas related to national security, so that it quite often will master and escape those constraints, which of course we've seen it do for a very, very long time now. On the other hand, where national security is not involved, the power of the president is often constrained by an anti-democratic, small d, Congress, even when the president reflects a popular desire to solve certain persistent social problems. Now, of course, that is true, but also we have to acknowledge that the president has not often, during this period of time, reflected a popular desire to solve certain persistent social problems. In fact, we probably haven't had that happen, had that occur. Well, maybe it did occur to some degree during Clinton's time, though I think he failed to solve those problems. And it was true that Reagan had a lot of popular support to solve certain social problems. He used the wrong remedies and failed to solve the problems. All of these anti-democratic elements are interrelated, but untying the Gordian knot they form is heavily dependent on legislation Congress is willing to pass. That, in turn, is very dependent on the capability of senators to use the filibuster and the seniority system to block all change, or to at least exact a heavy toll for their agreement in the form of concessions favorable to their states or districts at the expense of the common interest. So I think the filibuster and the seniority system are at the center of the anti-democratic elements we see in the U.S. political system. When we add the influence of lobbyists who are better funded than they ever have been in the past to these anti-democratic levers, we can see why plutocracy is emerging in the United States. Powerful and rich corporate interests provide legislators with information and financial support They need to communicate with their constituents and construct a narrative capable of persuading them that they're being well represented. The flow of information and financial support is constant. It's an everyday thing. But the flow of information and financial support from constituents is intermittent and waxes and wanes with the mass media attention given to particular issues. But political parties appeal to the public at large and to aggregate interests broadly. Their interest is in programs that fulfill public needs as they interpret those needs. But what the parties want to validate in the form of campaign promises and broad programs always takes a back seat to what the lobbyists and the corporatists want, because the filibuster and seniority systems in Congress give individual committee chairpersons and senators great power relative to party leaders. It is power they can use to obstruct change and defend the interests of lobbyists and corporatists against the forces of change in general and against specific changes the parties may have promised to the public. The big problem with all this is that the United States of America, like any complex adaptive system, needs to change in response to problems that develop in the course of time. Those problems are caused by both internal and external factors and by social, economic, technological, cultural, and political dynamics that are uncontrolled. If a political system is going to work in the long run, it needs to be able to solve those problems through its operations. Immobilist political systems, those that can pass new legislation to meet their serious problems, eventually become unstable and cease to serve the societies of which they are a part. That is a problem that now threatens us. Years ago, we used to make fun of the French and Italian political systems because they were so fragmented. I'm thinking here of the 1950s and 1960s, that their parliamentary governments were constantly failing, while failing to solve their most serious problems. But these days, it is we who cannot achieve or maintain a sufficiently powerful consensus to move our society forward. How many years has it been since we recognized that we needed to meet serious energy conservation, environmental, and climate problems? How many years has it been since we realized that American public schools were in trouble? How many years has it been since we recognized that economic inequality in America was increasing? How many years has it been since we recognized that we had no control over immigration in the United States? How many years has it been since we realized that our healthcare system needed reform? And how long has it been since we recognized that we had serious problems of structural poverty and unemployment? Well, now I think we recognize all these problem areas, don't we? In other words, almost 12 years later, we recognize that we have all these problem areas. But even though the recognition is now there, we haven't been able to do anything about them. Going on with the post, though, even when we move against short-term problems, such as the current recession or the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we cannot develop and maintain a consensus about what to do to solve these problems. We can look at the Trump period, by the way, as a period where we failed to develop a consensus about this and where the country became sharply divided. And obviously, the Trump administration did not solve the outstanding problems and was especially unable to cope with the virus. And that resulted in the defeat of Trump and the return of the Democrats to power, of course. So, I go on. Our solutions are inadequate, and short-term problems take much longer to solve than would otherwise be the case, and sometimes become long-term problems that are not solved for generations. For example, the situation in Iraq has not been solved now for a generation, right? We got into Iraq first got into Iraq at the beginning of the 1990s, right? It's a generation. We're still coping with it. Afghanistan, it's 20 years. We're still coping with it. I've said that at the center of the Gordian knot, of maladaptiveness lies the filibuster in the Senate and the seniority system in both houses of Congress. We need to get rid of those practices so we can begin to fix the other problems with simple majorities and party discipline in both houses of Congress. The filibuster should be handled first by using the nuclear option, quote unquote, as I've explained in another place. I'd written another blog at that time in February of 2009 concerning the nuclear option, and I've explained what it is to you in previous live streams. It takes only a majority vote to exercise the nuclear option. And once it is done, the filibuster need never come back because the procedural rule of the Senate would be superseded by the act of exercising the nuclear option. The seniority system will be harder to handle in the short run, since the junior members of the House and Senate who stand to gain the most from abolition of the system would probably be afraid to move against it while immersed in a congressional session. Also, the political process of overturning it would gain much greater momentum if opposition to the seniority system became a party commitment in a congressional election. If this could be done and the party advocating change were to win the election, the next Congress would be organized into committees whose leadership was appointed at the pleasure of the Speaker and the Majority Leader without seniority considerations entering into the process. This would increase the power of the Speaker and the Majority Leader relative to the members and greatly improve the party discipline. For example, what happens if Chuck Schumer had free reign right now to take away Joe Manchin's seniority? Would Joe Manchin really be protesting so loudly against the minimum wage and getting rid of the filibuster? Consider that for a minute. The United States is now a maladaptive giant whose political system cannot solve its national problems. While there are many aspects of its failure to adapt, its inability to pass legislation with simple majorities in both houses is a major factor in the immobilism of the system. And this, in turn, is related to the way the filibuster, the seniority system, and the system of lobbying interact. You really can't do anything about lobbying without fixing the other two problems first, because those who benefit from lobbyist funding will simply refuse to pass anti-lobbying laws, as they are now doing. But we can do something about the filibuster and the seniority system if we mobilize opinion against them and get people to understand that their government is the best that money can buy, primarily because of these two features of Congress. So let's stop lamenting the disappointing outcomes in reform legislation we've seen this year, that was in 2009, and begin to work against these two important props of our immobilist and dysfunctional political system. There is no room in American democracy for either of these two anti-democratic elements. I said that then. It's nearly 12 years later. We haven't done anything about those things for 12 years. We haven't even talked about the seniority system, and we haven't done anything about the filibuster, and we've hardly talked about that as well. So, we are now in the middle of a filibuster-caused crisis, by the way. It may not always look that way to you. For example, when we look at the crisis now in relation to the minimum wage bill, we see the Democrats are fixing to take it out of the Senate version. Why are they fixing to take it out of the Senate version? Well, they've got two Democratic senators who are not in favor of the minimum wage bill, and they don't want to compromise about it. They just want to tank it. That's what they want to do, and they're willing to hold up a bill that the American people sorely need, and they trust that the other members of the party will not subject them to a floor vote on either this huge package that people need or later on to a floor vote on the minimum wage. Because they can use the filibuster to stop such a floor vote. If the Democrats want a floor vote on the minimum wage at some time later on, as long as the filibuster is in place, they will not be able to get it. They will not be able to get it. You have to make Sinema and Manchin fold when it comes to a floor vote if you want to have the minimum wage. The best way to get them to fold on the minimum wage is to get them to fold on the filibuster first. So we get rid of the filibuster. So we can get bills to the floor whose presence on the floor will pressure them to go along with those particular bills, because they can't be seen to go on record against those bills. It might very well tank them in their states. So the filibuster is their protection, because the bills never get to the floor. So they never have to go on record against them. So therefore, God bless you.
Thank you.
So therefore, you cannot have the minimum wage bill come to the floor, because that takes away the cover for Sinema, for Manchin, and any other Democrats who have a question about whether raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour is a wise thing to do right now. Okay. Now, that is devastating for other reasons we will go into as we move forward in this live stream. So, next. Next up is a piece from Dave Sirota at the Daily Poster. Is it from Dave? No, it was written by Julia Rock and Andrew Perez. Not by Dave Sirota, I'm sorry. They report on House Dems demand Harris advance the $15 an hour minimum wage. And this is about a letter that was written to Kamala Harris by 23 progressive lawmakers in the House. They wanted to use her power as presiding officer of the Senate to immediately advance the $15 minimum wage that she has long said she supports. And they point out in their letter that 81 million people cast their ballots to elect you on a platform that called for a $15 an hour minimum wage. We urge you to keep that promise, unquote. And they also said we must act now to prevent tens of millions of hardworking Americans from being underpaid any longer. Yeah, roughly it said 32 million people would benefit from this bill. Now, the letter released Monday was signed by 23 Democrats, including Reps Ro Khanna, Pramila Jayapal, Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Jamal Bowman, and Cori Bush, and also Marie Newman, by the way, was in this group too. A member of the squad that was not in the group was actually Ayanna Pressley, who perhaps at the time was busy introducing the job guarantee bill into the House. So if she could not get to this letter due to that, I think we can forgive her. But anyway, raising the federal minimum wage from current $77.25 an hour to $15 an hour, yeah, would increase the wages of 32 million people. It says so here. Khan, of course, spoke to the Daily Poster. He's been speaking to everyone in sight that we believe the president, the bill the president signs, must include the minimum wage provision. And they point out in this blog, what I've pointed out in previous live streams, is that the presiding officer of the Senate is the decider, not the parliamentarian. That is absolutely true. And by the way, I don't know if this has been pointed out in other places. In her role as the VP, Harris is, of course, subordinate to the president. And she has to take his orders under pain of his not giving her any assignments, anything to do, just to sit there for all the years that she's in the VP's office. It used to be that VPs didn't do very much, that they basically sat around. Now, this was probably true. The first VP to probably be given anything to do by the president might have been actually Lyndon Johnson and Kennedy, though maybe there are instances when Nixon did things for Eisenhower. But really, it's relatively recently in history that the VP has been doing anything. Okay. But there's one role the VP has which is constitutionally specified and mandated specifically for the VP that the president can do nothing about from a legal standpoint. That role is as the presiding officer of the Senate. And one of the functions of the presiding officer is to make the parliamentary decisions and to cast the deciding vote. The parliamentarian is an advisor. The presiding officer is the decision maker, a point that this blog makes. But what the blog doesn't say is that that role as the decision maker is constitutionally specified for the VP. It doesn't say in the Constitution that the VP is to listen to what the president wants her to do in making decisions as the presiding officer. This is the VP's independent role prescribed by the Constitution. If Harris decides not to exercise this independent role, it is on her. It might be on Biden for expressing his preference that he wants her to take the advice of the parliamentarian. That might be the case. But the president is not in a legal position to order the vice president to respect, I shouldn't say to respect, to follow the advice of the parliamentarian. Now, much has been made of quotes coming from the vice president, from the White House, and from the president, that they respect the process and they respect the parliamentarian. In my view, this is not dispositive. You can respect the parliamentarian all day long, and you can respect her advice all day long. But having respect for her advice and respect for her opinion does not entail that you will necessarily follow that advice or follow that opinion. That is something more than simply respect. You can respect what she has to say and do something else because you respect your own opinion more. So, if Harris doesn't act to overturn the advice of the parliamentarian, that is her choice. She is saying she respects the parliamentarian's opinion more than her own because she stated her opinion on numerous occasions. And that opinion was that she favors the $15 an hour minimum wage. And she said so emphatically, and she said it's long overdue for the nation. And part of the reason why she was elected vice president was because she supported this particular position. Part of the reason why the ticket was selected was because they supported this position. While Democratic Senators Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin backed a minimum wage increase in 2014, they said they oppose including a minimum wage in the COVID bill. It's unclear whether they would vote to sink the entire relief package if Democrats include the measure and overrule the parliamentarian. My opinion is they would not. They would cave because that package is too important to them and their constituents. And I'll go over why later. By the way, the National Economic Council Director, Brian Deese, said on Friday on CNBC, quote, "The vice president's not going to weigh in. The president and the vice president both respect the parliamentarian's decision and process," unquote. If Bernie Sanders goes ahead with his plan to force a floor vote, and if he can get one on this, then the vice president is probably going to have to weigh in because somebody is going to raise a point of order concerning whether the minimum wage should be or can be in the bill, in the reconciliation bill. And then she's going to have to make that particular decision. That's the importance of Bernie getting a floor vote, because that can force her into the position of making a decision. So, the Post says the new letter from the House Democrats heightens the pressure on Harris, who has backed the $15 an hour minimum wage for years. Was she lying about that? In 2009, the federal minimum wage was set at $7.25 an hour. More than 10 years later, and it's still $7.25. We need a $15 an hour minimum wage to be the national floor now. Exactly 1 year ago today, she tweeted that. By the way, I believe this post was on March 1st. Sorry, I forgot to say that before. So, I won't go through the rest of the post. You get the point. As the House Democrats said in their letter to Harris, quote, "You have the authority to deliver a raise for millions of Americans," unquote. Well, she doesn't have authority to deliver it, but she has authority to include it in the bill. It would still then be up to all the rest of the Democrats, including Manchin and Sinema, to then deliver the raise to the millions of Americans. And of course, it would be up to Biden to sign the bill. Now, undoubtedly, if the minimum wage was included in the bill, Biden would sign it because it has too much of the other stuff that he wants it. He doesn't have the option of vetoing this bill, and he would not veto it. So whether he really wants it or whether he doesn't, he's got to have it. So you're getting the picture, I hope, as it shapes up. Let me make sure I got the right one here. Guess what else Joe Manchin's trying to do? This is from Jake Johnson today. Common Dreams, quote, bad policy and bad politics, unquote. Manchin is trying to cut unemployment benefits, limit survival checks in the COVID relief bill. He's still trying. He's still trying. After all these weeks, he's still trying to cut up the bill. Joe Manchin of West Virginia and other conservative members of the Senate Democratic Caucus. Okay, and by the way, if you can, contribute to the No Excuses PAC, the Corbin Trent, the Shoykat Chakrabarti PAC that is running ads against Manchin and Sinema. Because West Virginians have to know what the hell Manchin is doing to represent them. I'm sure that a heavy majority of West Virginians is for this bill as it stands with the minimum wage increase. And Manchin is where their senator is working against it. He's pressing for changes to the reconciliation bill that would cut the bill's proposed weekly unemployment supplement and further restrict eligibility for $1,400 direct payments, the impact payments. He wants to cut it back to $300 per week. He doesn't like the $400 per week boost to unemployment payments that is set to begin expiring on March 14th. He doesn't like that. I'm sure his constituents like it and want it. He said he'd prefer to see a benefit, $300 benefit, in response to criticism that some laid-off workers could end up making more money on unemployment they would on the job. A right-wing talking point that Republicans have deployed in their efforts to slash unemployment insurance benefits, yes. He says, we were just looking for a targeted bill. We just want targeting. We don't care if it takes an extra month or 2 months to get the targeting out there and people starving or evicted from their homes and suffer greatly. We don't care about that. We just want to make sure it's targeted perfectly so people don't make more on unemployment than they would in their jobs. The House passed relief bill calls for sending full $1,400 payments to individuals earning up to $75,000 per year and married couples earning up to $150,000, with the payments gradually phasing out thereafter, an eligibility structure that resembles the one used for the previous 2 rounds of checks. Despite warnings doing so would be politically suicidal, Biden has previously said he would be open to lowering the income cutoff before the direct payments, but he hasn't been talking like that lately. Anyway, progressive lawmakers are already furious over some of the plans by the Democrats in the Senate to move forward with a relief bill that excludes a minimum wage increase. Yes, any further restrictions would, as was said by Arindrajit Dubey, the economist, cautioned that slashing unemployment insurance benefits or imposing additional restrictions on eligibility for direct relief payments would, one, quote, cause a full-blown revolt from progressives, unquote. I think there's a full-blown revolt now on the minimum wage part of it, but it would be even more full-blown. It would be explosive. House Democrats, who did not have to contend with the Senate's so-called Byrd rule, included a provision to increase the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2025 in their relief bill. Of course, they did. And Jayapal said she warned late Monday that further targeting or tightening eligibility means taking survival checks away from millions of families who got them last time. That's bad policy and bad politics too. And of course, she's absolutely right. It is. So going on further, we come to Bernie, urging the Senate to ignore the advice of the parliamentarian. Sanders to force vote on $15 the minimum wage amendments. Quote, I regard it as absurd that the parliamentarian and Senate staffer elected by no one can prevent a wage increase for 32 million workers. I wish Bernie would not frame things in the incorrect way. First of all, Harris is right now not, well, I shouldn't say that. I guess what I object to in the framing, okay, is the idea that the parliamentarian can or would prevent a wage increase for the 32 million workers. It's not the parliamentarian who's preventing this right now. Right now, the preventers are Manchin, Sinema, Harris, and Biden, and the Republicans, of course. Those are the preventers. The leaders of the Democratic Party are the preventers. And maybe I'll include Schumer too, because evidently he's for stripping the minimum wage provision out of the House bill. I don't think that's happened yet, but they're on our way to it. That article, by the way, is by Jake Johnson. Calling on the majority in the Senate disregard the advice of the unelected parliamentarian. He announced he will force a vote this week on an amendment to include a $15 minimum wage provision in the pending $1.9 trillion coronavirus relief package. I don't know why he has to force a vote this week on an amendment. As I understand it, it's already in the House bill that has come up to the Senate for action by the Senate. As far as I know, there isn't a Senate bill that's gotten out of committee yet that doesn't have the minimum wage provision in it. I think Bernie's assuming that the committee assigned the House bill is headed by someone who will collaborate with Schumer in taking the minimum wage provision out. But maybe that is not true. I also take it that the bill has not directly come to the Budget Committee, or Bernie would not take that provision out of the bill. So I'm assuming here that what Bernie is assuming is that a bill will come to the floor that has to be amended to include such a provision, and that he will put such an amendment on the floor. And I wonder if he has the authority to do that. He must think he does, but I'm not sure of the details. In other words, if he tries to introduce a bill on the floor, I know 50 Republicans and 2 Democrats who would probably say, we're filibustering this bill, or we're filibustering this amendment. Now, I guess they can't, because he can propose an amendment. Bernie can propose an amendment. It's a reconciliation bill. So Bernie can propose an amendment as part of the vote-a-rama, though probably there'll be hundreds of votes coming up in the vote-a-rama. So in relation to the vote-a-rama, it's possible Bernie's amendment will somehow get lost or will be basically peremptorily dismissed. I'm not sure how powerful a move that is. I guess we just have to wait and see. Quote, at a time when millions of workers are earning starvation wages, he says, it's time to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. Well, you know that rap. And his announcement came at the time when the Democrats have signaled a retreat to include the minimum wage increase in the relief package after the advice of the parliamentarian, was given. Citing 2 anonymous Democratic aides, the Washington Post said on Monday Senate Democrats will move forward with a version of the relief bill that does not attempt to raise the minimum wage. And an initial procedural vote is expected as early as tomorrow. Bernie said he was extremely disappointed by the decision of the parliamentarian who ruled the minimum wage was inconsistent with the Byrd rule. It was a very arbitrary decision. I mean, that's certainly correct. There have been lots of things that have been ruled into reconciliation that had less of a budgetary impact than the minimum wage bill has. Bernie went on, by the way, in this statement said he's not sure that at this point his point of view is the majority view in the Democratic caucus. And he said, quote, obviously, as soon as we can, we have to end the filibuster that currently exists in the Senate. Given the enormous crises facing working families today, we cannot allow a minority of the Senate to obstruct what the vast majority of the American people want and need. So that's what he's going to try to do. Of course, concerns have been waged. Why have the Democrats been fighting so hard for Neera Tanden and they're not fighting for the $15 an hour? What's wrong with that? Well, the Democrats are no longer fighting for Neera Tanden, of course. She withdrew, evidently, this evening. Whether she was asked to withdraw or whether she withdrew, it was obvious that she wasn't going to be confirmed, that was gone. So she's gone now, and that's good. And we all, of course, like that. Final quote from Bernie. I would suggest that those who vote against it from a political point of view, that's a mistake. The American people want to see the minimum wage raised. Let me be very clear. If we fail in this legislation, I will be back, unquote. And he will be. He'll be back, I think, in a number of ways. He will be back with an attack on the filibuster. And by the way, that attack on the filibuster is going to be very important because it's not just Bernie alone who's going to be going against the continued filibuster, which, as I said, is what's giving Manchin and Sinema their power because it gives them cover. With no filibuster, they would be the deciding votes on the minimum wage bill. And in that situation, they're very unlikely to vote against it. They can be protesting all they want, that we don't need it, or it's not properly targeted, or this or that, or whatever BS they have. But if they're deciding votes against that, both Manchin and Sinema are politically dead in their states. Even if Trumpists are running against them, they're politically dead if they vote against a minimum wage bill straight up. But by itself, they'd be even more politically dead if they voted against the reconciliation bill with the minimum wage bill inside it. They would be politically dead too, deader than doornails. Okay, next victim here. Developing the argument in depth. Oh, that's still there. I thought I got rid of that already. Sorry. Oh, I know what happened. That's all right. Everything is all right. So now what you're looking at is a Common Dreams article that was done today, March the 2nd. Now is the time for boldness. Senators urge Biden to back recurring payments for COVID relief package. So there are some senators. This article was written by Andrea Germanis, staff writer for Common Dreams. There are senators who want to go further than what's in the recon bill now. Specifically, Ron Wyden, Sherrod Brown, among them. Senator Ron Wyden led a group of 10 senators on Tuesday in urging President Joe Biden to include recurring direct payments and automatic unemployment insurance extensions tied to economic conditions, automatic stabilizers, folks, automatic stabilizers, in his Build Back Better recovery proposal, telling the president, quote, "Now is the time for boldness. The measures are effective and widely supported." The letter, PDF, released on Tuesday, notes, quote, "This crisis is far from over. Families deserve certainty that they can put food on the table, keep a roof over their heads. Families should not be at the mercy of constantly shifting legislative timelines and ad hoc solutions," the lawmakers wrote. And the letter was spearheaded by Wyden, chair of the Senate Finance Committee, and the Budget Committee chair, Bernie Sanders, and Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs chair, Sherrod Brown, also signed on. The other signatories to the letter are Tammy Baldwin, Wisconsin, Michael Bennet of Colorado, even that prime neoliberal, Michael Bennet, Cory Booker, Kirsten Gillibrand, Ed Markey, Alex Padilla, I'm not sure how he pronounces his name, and Elizabeth Warren, Massachusetts. While unemployment insurance has provided a needed economic boost to millions, that support does not reach all the families severely impacted by the pandemic. The direct cash injections are thus, quote, "crucial for supporting struggling families," says the letter. What's more, recurring payments also serve as an, quote again, "economic stimulus by increasing spending and supporting jobs." To bolster their argument, the senators pointed to an Urban Institute analysis from July, showing that just one additional $1,200 check, along with extension of unemployment benefits and boosting SNAP, would keep 12 million people out of poverty. But The proposed one-time $1,400 checks is simply not enough, the group warns. Almost 6 in 10 people say the $1,400 payment said to be included in the rescue package will last them less than 3 months. So, they're advocating for lots of checks. That is a good sign. That is what fits the real situation. It's not the first time Biden has faced demands can go big with the stimulus payments. In January, Representative Ilhan Omar led a letter also calling on Biden to include recurring direct payments in any future relief package. A key obstacle is guess who? Joe Manchin, a $15 by minimum wage opponent who's asking Biden for a tightening of eligibility on the one-time $1,400 checks and reducing the unemployment supplement from $400 to $300 per week. And Pramila Jayapal said, quote, further targeting what tightening eligibility means taking survival checks away from millions of families who got them last time. That's bad policy and bad politics too, she tweeted. So, there you are. Now we come to one of our favorites, who is Dave Dayen. And Dave says, had some good things to say, as usual. In his column, Biden's rescue plan is necessary because inequality masks the economic pain. Plus, he includes in this column how to negotiate the minimum wage. And he wrote this today, March 2nd. And he starts out by saying an eligible family of 4 will get $7,600 in new money from the American Rescue Plan. And if those children are under 6 years old, that rises to $8,800. That comes from the stimulus check, which is $1,400 per person, including for all dependents, a first for coronavirus era bills, and that includes adult dependents. $1,400 per person times 4 is $5,600, folks. If those children are under 6 years old, there's another There's another $300 a month for children under 6 years old. So $300 a month for children under 6 years old. Let's see. The increase in the child tax credit as an advance monthly payment as well as the increase in the child tax credit as an advance monthly payment from $2,000 to $3,000, $3,600 if the child is under 6. Well, check me if I'm wrong, but if there's I don't think it can be that high. It can't be $3,600 a month. It must be $300 a month for each child under 6, over a yearly period, okay, over an annual period, if you have two children who are under 6, that would be $7,200. So I make it $7,200 plus $5,600 is $12,800, isn't it? Okay, I think it is. If one of the wage earners in the family is unemployed, they will also get $400 a week to supplement, okay, their unemployment check. Let's say that lasts for 6 months. That's 26 weeks at $400 a week in the boosted unemployment. $400 times 26, or $400 times 20 is $8,000. That's another $10,400 that they would get. So we're talking about people getting a boost of more than $20,000. That doesn't include any minimum wage increase when they start to get jobs. But what I'm saying, people, is this is serious money. Dave also points out if they qualify for food stamps, wait, I was figuring too much because this will only be an extension, okay, until August. So it's April, May, June, July, and the end of August. It's for roughly 5 months. But I think it would still come to over $20,000 altogether. But if they qualify for food stamps, they'll maintain a 15% increase in benefits there too. He says there are more numbers at HuffPost. So I'll take a look at HuffPost after this is over and see what HuffPost has to say about the numbers, but just out of interest. But the main point here is to notice that this bill is a heavy amount of aid for people. Unlike the previous bills, it's much, much more in terms of assistance for people, even not including the minimum wage. That is why, even if the minimum wage gets stripped out of this bill, Bernie won't vote against this bill. And the progressives in the House, the most lefty of them, will not vote against this bill. It has too much in it that is good for people. Anyway, Dave says, I wanted to put that in up front because there's a media bias towards only reporting things that are now or have changed in the past week or so. That is mainly meant reporting on the ARP, the American Rescue Plan, as a minimum wage bill. That's not really what the bill is about. It's a bill that creates, as its predecessor legislative efforts did, a pop-up safety net for those struggling in the COVID-19 crisis, and it puts a down payment on reversing 40 years of inequitable treatment for the middle class in America. It does this without giving a large chunk of money to multinational corporations and without abandoning state and local governments who have had to swell their own safety nets to manage the increase in precarity. It also tries to save the world by funding vaccine distribution. And yes, a lot of that distribution should be global. It's not going to have a minimum wage increase in it unless something changes dramatically in the next few days. But it will, have stuff in it. Yeah, lots of good stuff. There are two main objections to the bill, or at least to the economic relief portions of it. First, the economy is fine. Second, people have too much money already. When you break it down, those are the objections. They're a bit self-negating. Let's take them one by one. The economy is not fine. Real personal income less transfer payments, which is a measure of the economy absent government support, is down nearly 3% year over year. And that is a very big amount. And it decreased in January, so the trend is negative. This is a worse trough than the 1982 or 1991 recessions. Meanwhile, the low point in this cycle created last April was worse than the Great Recession. In other words, if you kick out the government props under the economy, it's not a pretty picture. Even if this is a distortion, because we know that the harm from COVID crisis collected in the low end of the income scale, every complaint about the ARP is sold as a story about the economy in aggregate, without accounting for that pain at the low end. But Matthew C. Klein managed to disaggregate some of the numbers last week. Klein cites the statistic showing that overall personal income with transfer payments has enabled trillions in new savings. This is the old, quote, people have too much money, unquote, argument. Add that to stock and home prices soaring, and net worth is substantially higher than 2019. But Klein takes that next step to show who is saving this money. The Federal Reserve's latest financial account data show a $2.3 trillion increase in liquid assets like bank deposits since the end of 2019. But, quote, about 28% of the increase in liquid assets went to Americans in the top 1% of the income distribution, unquote. Meanwhile, just 14% of that increase is held by the bottom 60% of income earners. And these figures cut off last September. We know that in the fourth quarter, when no additional federal support was coming in, lower income Americans drew almost 1/3 of their checking account funds out of the bank, and most Americans had less in checking at the end of 2020 than the previous quarter. Meanwhile, stock and housing wealth is concentrated at the top. To say this another way, Blackstone CEO Stephen Schwarzman took home $610.5 million in compensation last year. That could mess up the aggregate figures. It's just unlikely that there's this vast amount of unspent money at the low income end of the scale. What the anti-spending crowd will tell you then is that they agree it's just that any spending should be targeted. That gives away the game. Since we don't have the actual income data, we would need to target specifically. And since the income, and since the concentration of wealth means that suffering can be seen all the way through the middle class, we have to fire fairly indiscriminately to make sure nobody is left behind. The economic case for the American Rescue Plan, in other words, is extremely strong. Then we get to the minimum wage. That doesn't mean I'm not disappointed about the apparent extinguishing of a minimum wage increase in this bill. The weird tax incentive penalty idea to nudge higher wages was quickly found to be impractical and shelved, and the Biden administration is simply unwilling to follow the progressives' wishes and overturn the parliamentarian. But the minimum wage increase remains a live issue. I would frame this in a different way. I would say they're unwilling to take their responsibility to make the decision. They're trying to pretend that they don't have the responsibility to make the decision on whether to include the minimum wage in this bill. Kamala Harris does have the responsibility to make a decision about this, and not to pretend that the decision belongs to the parliamentarian. They are making the decision. It is on them. It's not about following the wishes of the progressives. It's about them making a decision to include the minimum wage increase in the bill or not. Anyway, that remains a live issue. The House has vowed to pass it as a standalone bill, probably in April. The Biden administration reinforced their commitment without addressing a plan to get it done. Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin have supported minimum wage increases in the past. Sinema's main objection right now seems to be putting it in the relief bill, not raising the wage. Manchin wants to go to $11 an hour. But though this has drawn objections, read the fine print. His $11 threshold would phase in over only 2 years, as opposed to the $15 threshold phasing in over 5 years. They're functionally equivalent, and you could always increase from there. He means you could always increase from the $11. Well, I think, as I recall, the proposal or the minimum wage bill from the House has an increase from $7.25 to $9.25 the first year, and from $9.25 to something like $11.25 or $11.50 in the second year. So that's not quite functionally equivalent to Manchin's $11 an hour. But if I were going at this and I wanted to negotiate it, and Manchin came at me, with $11 an hour, then what I would say to him is, okay, but the $11 an hour goes in right now. And then we reconsider the matter in 2 years. In other words, immediately up the people from $7.25 to $11 an hour right now. See what Manchin says to that. I bet his constituents might even like that better than the original increase, because they'd sure like to get from $7.25 to $9.25 right now. I'm sorry, to get from $7.25 to $11 an hour right now. Anyway, are the UN the filibuster or find 10 Republicans to support this bill? But several Republicans have spent the past week coming up with alternative wage hike ideas. There's at least a starting point for negotiations. Yeah, everybody seems to agree there should be a rise in the minimum wage. At least that's what they're saying to people. As Republicans want to avoid rejecting a popular policy. This is what I meant by putting the bill on the floor. Democrats might have to hear out the Republicans on E-Verify, the system intended to confirm eligibility to work at U.S. employers. You wouldn't need a militarized border if you accepted that concession and removed the economic incentives to immigrate to the United States. So if Republicans wanted to talk about demilitarization, so be it. In other words, what Dave is saying is that a good deal could be made if there was some agreement on the minimum wage that involved a substantial increase over the first 2 years, equivalent to what was in the original bill. Also included having the E-Verify system, so people could not come across the border to work in the U.S. any longer. And in the compromise was a demilitarization of the border again. He's saying that might be a really good deal for all concerned. So the point is, there's a chance to actually negotiate a solution, the baseline of which would be at least a 50% increase in pay for the lowest wage Americans. Time to hash it out and make as much progress as possible. I think those are interesting ideas. Next, another country heard from. This one is from the Patriotic Millionaires. So this came as an email, which you could view in your browser. So I'm doing this in the browser. This is to the friends of the patriotic millionaires. I'm evidently one of the friends because I certainly ain't no millionaire myself. But anyway, here we are. They are very much against the parliamentarians' advice. They say there's a much simpler solution to the problem of anti-democratic, illogical, outdated rules that desperately need to change in the Senate. And that simplest solution is to abolish the filibuster. And they go through all the things that I've gone through here. There's nothing in the Constitution about the filibuster. They go through the history of the filibuster, the Jim Crow use of the filibuster for so many years, and the more recent uses of the filibuster to slow down the Affordable Care Act, destroy the DREAM Act, stop by sensible gun reform laws. But they also say it's not about the history of the filibuster, it's about its future, as well. There's a range of legislation that's very important that we cannot even hope to pass without eliminating the filibuster. They point out that even without the filibuster, the Senate is already an inherently anti-democratic institution that allows a minority to block the will of the majority. The 50 Democrats in the Senate, they point out, represent 41.5 million more people than the 50 Republicans. Yet the filibuster adds on a further anti-democratic element. Without a $15 an hour minimum wage, millions of Americans are condemned to live in dire poverty, despite working full-time jobs, they say. Without D.C. and Puerto Rican statehood, millions of Americans will continue to be disenfranchised with no meaningful representation in the federal government, they say. Without H.R. 1, a broad package of democracy reform measures, the rights attack on voting rights will continue unabated, even further tipping the playing field in favor of power-hungry bad actors. None of those stand any reasonable chance of receiving 10 votes from the Republicans in the Senate. None are possible without eliminating the filibuster. It's time for Senate Democrats, particularly the moderates, quote unquote, who see the filibuster as a valuable piece of the Senate process, to get real. There are two choices here. Preserve the filibuster and get almost nothing accomplished over the next 2 years outside of the incredibly limited and incredibly flawed reconciliation process, or eliminate the filibuster, pass legislation that improves the lives of millions of Americans, and fulfill your promises to voters. The answer should be obvious. The American people need a Senate that prioritizes people over norms. And of course, they end up by saying what we all say in one way or another. The American people do not care about the filibuster. They care about the outcomes the party in charge can generate. Clinging to the filibuster to avoid voting on legislation is a dereliction of duty, and voters know that. If Democrats want to stand any chance of keeping control of the House and Senate in 2022, they need to show voters real wins, not excuses for why they couldn't accomplish what they promised despite controlling majorities in both houses. It's time for the Democrats to play hardball and get to work. The first step to that is eliminating the filibuster. What I have to say to the patriotic millionaires about that is, if you really want to eliminate the filibuster, then use your considerable financial power to get behind Corbin Trent and the No Excuses PAC so they could flood the airways in Arizona and West Virginia to tell the people there the truth about what Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are doing in the Senate. That's what the patriotic millionaires ought to do. But what about this? What about what they are doing? Well, Manchin has come back to all this. Today, March 2nd, as Manchin yells, he will, quote, never, Jesus Christ, unquote, vote to kill filibuster. Warren and Sanders demand an end to archaic rule. And Joe Manchin said, with the fate of major voting rights, minimum wage, immigration, and climate legislation likely hanging on the Democratic majority's willingness to eliminate the filibuster, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia on Monday yelled at reporters that he will, quote, never, unquote, agree to scrapping the 60-vote threshold standing in the way of his own party's agenda. Quote, Jesus Christ, what don't you understand about the never, unquote, said Manchin. An outburst that came as Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren both stressed the necessity of eliminating the filibuster in the wake of the Senate parliamentarians' advisory ruling against the inclusion of a minimum wage increase in the emerging coronavirus relief package. The parliamentarians' widely disputed opinion lays bare the severe limitations inherent in using the filibuster-proof the reconciliation process to leapfrog obstructionist Republicans. Asked whether there's any, quote, practical vehicle left for Democrats to raise the minimum wage, Warren said in an appearance on MSNBC Monday that, quote, of course it can happen if we just get rid of the filibuster. Okay. So, of course, that's what it comes down to. Manchin can yell all he wants. Let the ads run. Let those ads run in his state. See how long it takes him to back off. Better still, keep the minimum wage bill in the reconciliation bill. Keep it in there. Don't strip it out. Subject Manchin and Sinema to a floor vote on it with the minimum wage bill in it. The whole reconciliation bill with the minimum wage bill in it, and see if they dare to vote against it. If they dare to vote against it. I'd like to see that happen. They could bring it on, is what I have to say. I don't think they would dare. It would have been better for them if the parliamentarian had ruled it in and the minimum wage bill stayed there, because then they could have quietly voted for the relief bill with maybe a few words of objection, and they would have postponed the crisis over the filibuster. Now, what these idiots have done is to bring the filibuster front and center because they're being so stubborn and so stupid and working against the interest of people in their state. They have both claimed the filibuster is necessary to promote bipartisanship. Well, we're going to see about that, because the next thing that we're going to go over is going to talk about that. But before we do, notice that the fate of the whole Democratic Party depends upon whether they can pass H.R. 1, because now more than 250 vote suppression bills have been introduced at the state level recently. I would not be surprised to see some state Republican Party attempt to pass a law straight up banning Democrats from voting at some point. That's a quote from a Ryan Cooper column we'll soon go over. Moderate Democrats in the Senate have a choice to make. They can either defend democracy, the Constitution, by passing H.R. 1, or they can save the McConnell filibuster. They can't do both, unquote. And now we will move to Ryan Cooper's column, which will still not put a final capper on this. Anyway, this, as I said, is by Ryan Cooper, and the title is Democrats Need to Choose, the Filibuster or Democracy. I was asking them to make that choice back in 2009. I worked really hard on that back on 2009. I had a raft of columns on that. Anyway, March 2nd, 2021, in the week by Ryan Cooper. The pandemic relief package is reportedly close to passage. And so Democrats are turning their attention to House Resolution 1 or H.R. 1. That's not an H.R. resolution. It's not a House Resolution 1. It's a bill, Ryan. H.R. 1 is a bill. A massive, if it were a resolution, it would be an H-Res, not an H.R. H.R. 1, a massive voting rights overhaul that would ban partisan gerrymandering, expand voting rights protection, impose new restrictions on campaign finance, and more. If passed, it would be the most significant such law since the Voting Rights Act of 1965. By the way, lately there are objections to that bill because it has provisions in it that disadvantage third parties, that put third parties at a severe disadvantage, and that do even more than already exists to protect the favored position of the major parties. So clearly, we need to work to get those provisions stripped out of H.R. 1. But the main provisions are not about that. The main provisions are protections for democracy. So, while of course protecting third parties is protecting democracy too, and we have to work hard to get those things stripped out of the bill, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, because if we do, well, we'll get to what the consequences are in a very few minutes. Anyway, if passed, H.R. 1 would be the most significant such law since the Voting Rights Act of 1965. With any luck, the pandemic relief package will be big enough to restore a prosperous economy within a year or so. Therefore, whether or not Democrats can overcome the Senate filibuster and their own timidity to pass H.R. 1 is now the most important single factor in whether they can hang on to their congressional majorities and hence stop Republicans from cheating them permanently out of national power. In the background, the Republicans are loudly promising to cheat their way to victory in 2022. Brutal gerrymanders in Republican-controlled states are already on deck, ready to go as soon as problems with census data get ironed out. More than 250 vote suppression bills have been introduced at the state level. And then there's the quote about banning Democrats from voting at some point. The Republicans are also trying to further eviscerate Americans' voting rights through judicial rule by decree. Chief Justice John Roberts already unilaterally rewrote Section 4 and 5 of the Voting Rights Act in a decision that didn't even cite the Constitution, and now Arizona Republicans are pressing forward with a case trying to strike down Section 2, which bans Jim Crow-style infringements of the right to vote based on race. With a 6-3 conservative majority on the Supreme Court, the prospects look grim. Even if Democrats get exactly the same proportion of the vote they got in 2020 in the midterms next year, gerrymandering will probably cause them to lose the House at least. Stringent vote suppression will probably lose them the Senate too. And from there, the Republicans evince every intention of trying to cheat their way to permanent one-party rule in the United States. They already tried to overthrow the 2020 election and install Trump through legal chicanery and fomenting a literal putsch. If they took back the House and Senate, it would not be that hard to finish the job. In other words, if you want a good chance of American democracy continuing to exist at all, H.R. 1 is a necessary precondition. But that brings me to the Senate, a place where hopes and dreams go to die. Voting rights have nothing to do with the budget. So according to the Kafkaesque Senate rules, H.R. 1 can be filibustered. So far, conservative Democratic senators like Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema have said they do not support ending the filibuster. If even one of them holds to that view, H.R. 1 is dead. From a historical standpoint, this is a maddening position. But Manchin and Sinema pose as the defenders of traditional Senate norms and procedures, but as I've previously written, the modern Senate filibuster, where basically every normal bill is blocked and only must-pass budget items or totally anodyne things get through, is not even 15 years old. But Mitch McConnell basically invented this filibuster by himself in 2007, and even since then it has been amended several times. The routine 60 vote requirement has ended regular order budgeting, incidentally leading to a plague of sloppy bill drafting, concentrated power in the party leadership in both the House and Senate, throttled traditional congressional careers, and even harmed the moderates' beloved bipartisanship. Back when 51 votes were enough to pass a law, there was a lot more compromise and collaboration because members of Congress often figured that if something was going through anyway, they might as well see what they could get with their vote. The reconciliation process is another procedure that bears almost no resemblance to how it was originally intended to work. It was created in 1974 with the Congressional Budget Act. Originally supposed to be a way to pass through annual budget measures in an expedited fashion. It was hence only used occasionally. But since it can also be used as an end run around the filibuster, now the parties try to lard up their reconciliation packages by bending the rules as far as possible. Thus, the recent argument between Bernie Sanders and the parliamentarian about whether the predicted budget impact of a $15 an hour minimum wage would be merely incidental, quote unquote, in keeping with the reconciliation rules, which Sanders lost, alas. One can easily despair over all this stupid nonsense. A great nation should pass law based on who wins elections, not who can come up with most tendentiously expansive readings of some obscure procedural rule. However, it's also true the Senate can change its own rules at any time, overrule the parliamentarian, keep the filibuster while getting rid of the one McConnell invented. 50 senators plus Vice President Harris could vote that voting rights measures can't be filibustered, or could be included in reconciliation, or Democrats could make filibusters much harder to do. Currently, they only require a single email from a staff assistant, by the way, or add a time limit or some other fix. The options are endless. He's right about that. But the point is, to do it with 50 senators plus Vice President Harris, what he's saying is that the filibuster has to be stopped. You have to get closer with the 50+1 votes. You can't get that closure until you overturn the 60-vote rule. You can't. Once you overturn the 60-vote rule, then the 60-vote rule can't be used anymore. You've gotten rid of the filibuster. You might as well just get rid of the filibuster. Not do anything fancy by getting rid of this rule or that rule or the other rule. Get rid of Rule 22, the filibuster rule, altogether. Without Rule 22, the Byrd rule just goes out. Anyway, the moderate Democrats in the Senate have a choice to make. They can either defend democracy and the Constitution by passing H.R. 1, or they can save the McConnell filibuster. They cannot do both. So, that's it for that very well-written piece. I'm going to impose on you now a little further because you have to be apprised as to where this is going if the filibuster does not go and H.R. 1 is passed. Now, with Ryan Cooper, and H.R. 1 is not passed, what Ryan Cooper had to say is apropos about the Republicans cheating their way into being a permanent majority party. But that is not the worst of it. The worst of it is in the latest column, from Umar Haque. Don't know how he pronounces his name. I suppose one day I should ask him, maybe even have him on the show and ask him. But he did a piece on fascism. And he says that American fascism is becoming American, it's becoming American Nazism. Can't even say it. Here's a picture of CPAC, of the stage on CPAC, looking very like a Nazi type of room. And here's the article. Let me try to make sense of what's happening to the right wing in America. It's as simple as it is chilling. Oh, I should specify. This was done on February 27th by Haque. I just picked it up today. He says American fascism is now becoming American Nazism. Yes, really. There's a big difference between the two. Fascism is an angry teenager. Nazism is a bureaucrat organizing a mass atrocity. By the way, we had a little bit of that under Stephen Miller and the Department of Homeland Security in the Trump administration. We've got a little bit of a hangover now because that part of the Trump regime was certainly inclining towards Nazism. Anyway, Haque says, Nazism is what happens when fascism grows up. That's what's happening in America right now. Interesting thesis, isn't it? Making matters worse, as I'll come to, the Dems are fumbling in the background, letting fascism's embryo reach Nazism's adulthood with barely a whimper. Let me try to explain. A few years ago, when American fascism exploded, just as I'd predicted, as many had, it was just that, a nascent fascist movement. It dabbled with doing things fascist movements always dream of, having ascended to having its very own demagogue in the White House, bans, camps, kids in cages, kids in cages in camps, raids, purges, Gestapos, beatings, disappearances, hate, all culminating in a violent coup. The coup on January 6th was a turning point. At least that's how history will remember it. That's going unnoticed by Americans, at least by liberal Americans. But it was a moment of sudden and sweeping transformation for the Republicans and their base. Violence was legitimized. The big lies were acted upon. Brutality was normalized. A head of state allegedly led a violent coup that left 5 people dead and counting to overthrow a democratically elected government by trying to stop the process of vote counting. It's a minor miracle there wasn't a massacre. Why do I say that was a turning point? Because after that, Republicans could have thought, quote, we've gone too far, unquote, or, quote, that was wrong, unquote, or, quote, that was way too much and we are on the wrong path, unquote. And to be fair, a few have, a tiny, slender few. That is the exception which proves the rule. By and large, Republicans, not just leaders, but everyday people believe the election was stolen and therefore, quote, it needed to be taken back, unquote, presumably by any means necessary, right up to paramilitaries storming Congress and hunting down members of Congress to kill. If you think that statement is extreme, what was the gallows outside of the Congress for? What was the gallows for? What were they looking for Pelosi to do? What were they looking for AOC to do? What were they looking for Mike Pence to do? What were they going to do to Mike Pence? Republican support for Trump has soared after the coup. I'm not quite sure about that, but anyway, he does give a link. The reason that Republican leaders don't disavow Trump is because they can't. They'll lose grassroots support. So they're caught between a rock and a hard place. At least, quote, moderates, unquote, like Mitt Romney, who it should be widely understood, are still as conservative as, say, fanatical right-wingers in Europe. The quote, the moderates, quote unquote, can't fully attack Trump because they will lose their positions in the party. What does that tell you? It should tell you 3 things, all of which are very, very bad. 1, it's Trump's party now. 2, it's Trumpism's party. And 3, January 6th was a moment that sealed the American right's fate and destiny from a nascent fascist movement to a now aspiring Nazi one. What's the difference? A fascist movement is a coalition of social groups. They're still debating goals and purposes. They agree on general philosophical principles. To use that word far too generously, but you know the score. It's the old, but Nietzschean logic. They're the weak and the strong. The weak deserve to perish, the strong to survive, and the strong must prove their strength, therefore, by dominating the weak. The Spencerian form of social Darwinism, that was. Herbert Spencer, I'm referring to now. All that is broken down along lines of race, quote unquote, which is an artificial construct to begin with. After all, most white people are actually pink, and there are no yellow, quote unquote, or red, quote unquote, or black, quote unquote, people at all. Those are just boxes we force people into. A fascist movement is testing the waters. It's disseminating this moral logic of the strong subjugating the weak among itself. It is busy developing this logic in mythologies and fairy tales that then go on to provide a real-world belief system which justifies oppression and hate. It is toying with creating institutions to turn this abhorrent moral philosophy of strong dominating weak along racial lines into a social and political reality. A fascist movement is like any other movement in that regard. It is vying for power. Its philosophies yet to harden and coalesce really into widely held mythologies and symbols and belief systems, which then trickle down further into institutions and norms and values and aspirations and goals. All that's a little soft, but do you see the difference? Let me make it clearer. Fascism is Trump challenging the courts with ban after ban. But Nazism is a group at CPAC standing on a white supremacist symbol-shaped stage, chanting slogans that are barely even veiled code for fascism anymore. By the way, if you're looking at the Rune controversy, yes?
The Democrats didn't stick up
for what?
Democracy. The Democrats didn't stick up for it.
Well, that's the point of this. They're not standing up for it now.
Yeah.
And I'll explain how in a couple of minutes. By the way, if you've been looking at the Rune controversy, that apparently the CPAC stage is shaped like a literal Nazi symbol, and wondering, quote, am I paranoid to think there's a connection here, quote? No, of course you're not paranoid. Symbolism is a huge part of any Nazi movement, and the burden of disproof should always rest on people who espouse openly fascist beliefs. If a Nazi tells you this clearly who they are, believe them. Nazism is what happens when a fascist movement unites, hardens, and develops. Develops what? Long-term plans. For what? For things like final solutions, for race laws, quote unquote. When it develops goals and aspirations to seize total control of society, when it hardens, when violence and brutality to the point of assassination and murder become acceptable to the rank and file in a casual way, when things like violent coups become perfectly legitimate, when it unites, when things like violent coups attain mass support that reaches the level of almost perfect consensus. Do you see what I mean? Feel a chill if you did. Think about it carefully. Uniting, hardening, and developing is exactly what is happening on the stage at the Conservative Political Action Conference. Republicans are not divided at all. All that stuff from pundits about a civil war is completely false. Republicans are united in a horrifying way. The vast majority of them support Trump, even after what happened on January 6th. The big lie that the election was stolen has almost uniform support among the right. That's unification. What does the election was stolen, quote unquote, really mean? That it was stolen from us, quote unquote, meaning the chosen people, the pure and true, the real, quote unquote, Americans to whom the soil belongs and will take it back with blood if necessary. For just that reason, you see figures like Josh Hawley skyrocketing in fame and popularity. And the truth is that they are way, way more dangerous than Trump. That is because they are politically savvy and organized. Trump was a bumbling incompetent by comparison. He wasn't a good enough manager to get a large-scale atrocity done, just an emotive demagogue. Hawley, on the other hand, is ruthless, organized, and determined. He is the GOP hardening into, uniting behind, and developing into Nazism proper. Hardening, uniting, and developing. I want you to really reflect on those three words, because the sad truth is that right about now, the Dems are blowing it. Big time. They caved to a veritable nobody, and the minimum wage didn't pass. They're back to being what more or less anyone sane feared, putting kids in camps and bombing countries to look tough, when the opposition to fascism is itself pretty fascist. Who reopens concentration camps? Where can a country really go? Not away from fascism, that's for sure. The Democrats are going to lose fast at this rate by 2022 because their fragile coalition is splintering. Millions of young people and progressives walked away the moment they put kids back in camps, shaking their heads. And millions more will every time they do that or drop another pointless bomb or fail to raise the minimum wage. The Democrats are terrible at politics. Politics is a game that must be played with ruthlessness, courage, and abandon. And the Democrats, even Bernie folks, don't seem to have the stomach for it. Warren certainly doesn't. It's easy to see their fragile coalition of young progressives and minorities, plus neoliberals, fracturing before your very eyes. Bang! They're gone by 2022. What happens then? Well, meanwhile, the GOP is developing, uniting, and hardening behind, around, into proper and very real Nazism. It's painfully naive to think that by 2022, a party that doesn't have massive, almost unanimous support for a big lie and a fascist coup isn't going to develop a careful, detailed agenda. To what? To advance fascism into a hardcore political cause. To do things like camps, bans, raids, purges, Gestapos, but this time do them right, on a much vaster scale, with far more funding, resources, and momentum. A detailed and cohesive agenda to turn America's institutions and power structures and governing mechanisms fascist, to make all that happen with terror and intimidation and brutality, to ignite another coup, this time one that succeeds. All that's Nazism. Some Americans, white liberals, I imagine, will have trouble believing the above. What exactly do you think guys like Josh Hawley and Madison Cawthorn are doing in their off time, apart from allegedly being sexual predators? Playing pinochle, taking selfies? They are committed to the cause before them, and that cause is now right out in the open. The mythologies of modern-day fascism are the stuff of everyday reality, from QAnon and its coming, quote, storm, unquote, where the rest of us perish, to quote, white genocide, unquote, to the bizarre evangelical Christo-fascism that's taken root alongside older forms of white supremacy. All those have united, hardened, and developed into mainstream Republican culture, society, norms, values, beliefs. They are just what you live, are immersed in, surrounded by, if you're in that world now. Turn on faux news, and you'll see Stephen Miller talking about the Democrats being cruel by reopening concentration camps. That's how bad the Dems are at politics. But it's also how deluded the average right-winger American is now. To them, an architect of mass repression who designed policies of outright supremacy has been legitimized and normalized as a pundit. And after they see him on the news, they log into Facebook and read myths about Hillary Clinton filleting kids' faces off to drink their adrenalized blood. Is it any wonder they support things like coups, violence, supremacy, brutality? American right-wingers have been radicalized into becoming the country's Taliban or ISIS. They believe just the same level of insane myths back the same kinds of repression and supremacy, which are flip sides, and have the same contempt for democracy and its values of equality and freedom and justice. They're quite happy to back outright violence now to attain power too. You have to conclude that after so many Republicans voted against impeaching Trump, voted against conviction in the Senate, and so many House Republicans voted against impeachment. They found it acceptable that he motivated the attack on the Capitol itself, including them. An out of control mob, once it gained control of the Capitol and started hanging congresspeople, there's no telling where they would have stopped. They would hang any congressperson they could get their hands on, like the Paris mobs with the guillotines. Except at least they had show trials in Paris during the 1790s. Average Americans, millions of them, becoming something very much like a Taliban or ISIS, are the final nail in the coffin of American collapse. The Dems' incompetence is helping things along, to be sure. But even so, a society doesn't often survive huge groups being radicalized in such insanely extreme ways. There is absolutely no doubt in anyone's mind who's a seasoned observer of failed states about this ugly fact. Let me warn you then, as seriously as I can, that American fascism is becoming American Nazism. That was where it was always going, yes. But to see it happening before our eyes is something else, something new, frightening, and strange that bodes ill for the future of an already struggling society. Okay, and he signs this at Umair, February 2000, okay, and 21. You don't have to agree with it to conclude that that is a great and powerful post. After reading it, whether you fully believe the Republican Party is as far gone as he thinks it is, and whether you fully believe that it can transform and unify and harden in just that way while seeking power in 2022 and 2024, you have to give a great deal of consideration to the following. What happens when a maladaptive society such as our own finds it impossible to adapt to change? The Biden administration may be our last chance to adapt. But I'll tell you the kinds of things that happen to complex adaptive systems when they become unstable and fail to maintain themselves at the edge of chaos by adapting to their state of affairs with solutions to the problems that they face. What happens to them is generally that they can metamorphose into a rigidified, authoritarian, totalitarian structure, as would occur in a Nazi state or a fascist state, whether you believe it will be fully Nazi, okay, or not. Well, it will go as far as the Hitlerian state, or stay something like a Mussolini type of state. But going that way is one possible solution. The other way that it might go in its efforts to adapt because of the failure to meet its problems, the other way it can is into governmental chaos. That is, the system can break down into instability, seeking solutions for its problems. The kind of movement that the Republican Party is prompting now could create a situation over the next 2 years where all of us get ready for civil war. It can be that bad. It can get that bad if we see what Hake is talking about actually transforming. So, when you consider the possibility of that, and then you think back again, what legislation now has to be passed to begin to solve our problems? All the types of legislation that we named earlier. When you begin to think about those various types, of legislation, and when you begin to think about the need to pass H.R. 1 or some version of H.R. 1 to get a free and fair election in 2022, you realize that the point of leverage, the key point of leverage to have a chance for the maladaptive giant to adapt in the future, the key point of leverage is the filibuster. It has to go so we can pass H.R. 1, so we can pass criminal justice reform and police reform, so we can begin to do justice in the various areas of our society, because that is the only way to stop the transformation of the mass of the Republican Party into fascism and Nazism, to lure them away from the current transformation that is going on. If the Biden administration should fail, and if it should fail because it insists that the Senate norms are more important than doing the justice that people need right now, then maintaining the filibuster will lead to paralysis and to immobilism in the next 2 years of the Biden administration, which, as sure as you can conceive, is going to result in a takeover of one or both houses of the Republicans in 2022, and then very likely a sweep by the Republicans in 2024, because the Democrats it will be fresh in the minds of people that the Democrats are a failed party that failed to produce in 2021 and 2022. It's so clear that that's the way this is likely to go, and that the key to the crisis we're coming to is going to be the ability of the Democrats to get rid of the filibuster in the Senate so they can pass all the corona relief measures they need to pass, sure. But in addition, the minimum wage, the climate change, green bills. Yes, Medicare for all, eventually, as well. But in short, so they can do the justice they have to do without being blocked by a Joe Manchin or a Kirsten Sinema. We have to stop this business of requiring unanimity among a block of people to get anything done. Remember the Poles, who before the third partition had set up rules in the Polish Diet that required everyone to agree before anything could be done. The result was the third and final partition of Poland. And Poland did not get back an independent state from the 1790s until after the First World War. That's what happened to Poland. What can happen to us will be even worse, because if the Nazis, with their ideas about climate change and struggle and the strong over the weak take over, then the climate emergency will not be handled, and our civilization and our very lives will be gone. So, I will now entertain your comments. Sorry for keeping you so long, but there was a lot to say. Yes, I think there's a straight line from breaking the filibuster to actually surviving the crisis that we are in. Okay, I don't have any comments before 9:43. I don't know why that's the case. I had comments before, but they somehow are not on my comment feed right now. But since that's the case, I will pick this up at 9:43. Yeah, my first comment is from Lana at 9:44. She said, I'm working as usual, mostly interesting. And Troy says, no excuses, Pack. Okay, maybe next payday. I'm getting overtime this week. Kay says, doesn't look that way, Terry. I don't know which Terry that was. Evelina says, I know, the joke is on the people. Only parliamentarian advisor should be the people's rep, lately Congress. Evelina says, namely, not lately. Parliamentarian is O'Donnell or something like that. Okay, it's actually McDonough, her name is. And I'm sure that she's a perfectly fine person. She was probably just reading signals from the Biden administration that whatever the House wanted and whatever Bernie Sanders wanted, what the Biden administration really wanted was not to have a vote on the minimum wage. She was probably just reading those signals. Anyway, Steve Gonzo says, but nearer tears than Twitter isn't an interview. Kay says Biden has not done a damn thing about expanding Social Security either. Rumsky, who was trying to kill it, is still in there. He needs to go now. And Terry Burke says, yep, that Terry Burke. Yep, that sounds exactly right, Dr. F. They don't want folks to excel, so they'll come to their senses about how much they're enslaved to exploitive corporations and industries under unemployment benefits. And Troy says socialist clubs, groups with their own mutual aid societies are springing up in Texas. That's great. Terry Burke says, but Bernie gets on my effing nerves with his tax and spend misinformation. He no longer impresses me or has me thinking that he is genuine. Uh, well, yeah, there's the Taxon spend misinformation, but I just saw an interview of Ro Khanna. But she was on the Bad Faith program with Bree Joy and Virgil Texas, and he was, and he knows better too. He was constantly talking about, yeah, we can take that money, we can tax the rich, and we can take that money and we can use it for spending on this and spending on that. And he was saying this minute after minute after minute. And by the way, Virgil Texas and Bree Joy Gray and Ro Khanna, all three of them know some MMT. And Ro Khanna purportedly knows a lot about MMT. They all know perfectly well that taxes are not spent for anything. They all know taxes are destroyed. Troy says, good old Chucky Shoe. Steve Day smiles. Evelina says, yep, those are the preventers, Dr. Joe. But they're saying it's the parliamentarian who is preventing. The parliamentarian is not preventing anything. She's just an advisor, of course. Steve says, BS seems to somehow always straddle the plausible plausible deniability wire. And to that, I just have to respond, look, I don't know about you, but I'm sick and tired of the lies, and I don't want to even soften them by calling them simply BS. They are lies. The Biden administration lies. They have lied from the beginning, from the start. They may not lie as much as Trump. You might not be able to catalog, to keep score in the many thousands of lies as you've been able to do with Trump. But whenever they get into the least little bit of trouble, they gaslight. They gaslight. We got to respect the process and respect the parliamentarian. Sure you do. Sure you do. Sure you do. Where is it in the Constitution? Where is it in the law? It's not. That's a lie. They don't have to do anything. Where does it say the parliamentarian makes a decision? Nowhere. It's a lie to say that. It's not their first lie either. Where are the immediate $2,000 checks? Oh no, we said they would be $1,400. The House Democrats said it would be $1,400. They wrote a bill for $1,400 in the last part of the Trump administration. But Biden said it was going to be $2,000 and said it was going to be going out immediately. Instead, they went for a reconciliation bill. They didn't go for direct payments going out immediately. They didn't put that bill on the floor the first day that Biden got into the presidency. They didn't put that bill on the floor in that day. That bill has still not been passed today. It's March 1st. They said immediately. They lied. They said 2,000. They lied. Steve Day said, ask the parliamentarian, laugh out loud. The parliamentarian advised that we can provide billions of dollars to private insurance companies with 51 votes, but need 60 votes to raise the wages of 32 million workers by increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour. I don't know how apt that particular analogy is, because it was the government providing the billions of dollars to private insurance companies. That certainly has an effect on the government budget. But the 60 votes to raise the wages, there was the decision about, well, it was incidental, it was not incidental. I'll tell you part of the problem with this, and no one has raised this point. Part of the problem with this whole process is that Bernie played the game. That is to say, he went in the budget reconciliation process and he raised people's hopes concerning the reconciliation process, because he said, boy, he was waiting to get his hands on the reconciliation process as the chair of the Budget Committee of the Senate. He led us to believe he could do all kinds of things with the reconciliation process. He should have continued on with the reconciliation process. When CBO came out with its scoring of the bill, he should have said at that point, it is clear from CBO's scoring of this bill that the minimum wage provision has a clear impact on the federal budget. It has an impact on safety net expenses, and it has an impact on taxes, okay, as well. It has budgetary impact. It is therefore within the realm of reconciliation. And it's my judgment we can put this bill on the floor that way. I know people are going to seek the advice of the parliamentarian, and that's fine. But I'm not seeking the parliamentarian's advice. I'm not making any arguments to the parliamentarian, but instead Bernie played the game. I got all these lawyers, and we're going to see the parliamentarian, and she's going to decide that wherein he implied, he had full confidence that the parliamentarian was going to decide this. So he empowered the parliamentarian. His strategy from the beginning should have been, I don't give a damn what the parliamentarian says. CBO says this has an impact on the budget. And he should have been propagandizing that from the time CBO came out with the budget, and he should have been pressuring Biden and Harris from that very moment, saying, look, CBO says it has a budgetary impact, therefore it's within the purview, okay, of reconciliation. If anybody dares to make a point of order to the contrary, it's on you to decide that it stays in the bill. Bernie should have been making that case from the day. I think he blew that because he is not aggressive enough. He doesn't play hardball enough. Kay says, the actual $15 doesn't kick in for years anyway, not till 2025, right? Such a big word for having hardly any significance, laugh out loud. Steve Gonzo says, the sometime in the near future line is tired. Control of 3 branches is now, right? Lana says, Jordan Chariton said yesterday, it's not control of 3 branches because they don't have control of the Supreme Court, do they? Jordan Chariton said yesterday that Bernie is burning out. Someone inside supposedly gave him that info. If true, I don't blame him. I am feeling the same. Look, I'm just calling attention to the mistakes that he made. I recognize that Bernie is burning out. I mean, maybe that's why he gave in to Biden so early instead of continuing the run. I mean, he had a heart attack after all. It did interrupt the campaign. It probably cost him some Iowa votes. It probably meant he had to be a little more careful, okay, in the rest of his schedule. He then had the disappointment, and depression of having to cope with COVID during the campaign, so he could not rely so much on his ground game. That had to be terribly depressing. Anybody would feel burned out after that. He also wasn't much of a factor in the CARES Act. Why not? Because I think his campaign had ended and he was just feeling burned out, and he wasn't. I think he was taking a little downtime and he wasn't aware of what was going on. So he wasn't aware of the money cannon that was being prepared for the rich in the CARES Act. Kay says, I had hoped Schumer would be more left. Shake my head. There I go, hoping again. I was hoping AOC, the threat of AOC primarying him, could make him go more left. Maybe he still will go more left. Maybe AOC has to get a lot louder about that primary challenge. Evelyn says, that's when the next raise will be due. Then it will be here we go again and again, but nothing happens. Well, it may be that nothing happens, but if they get the raise for the first 2 years up to 11, they're going to get credit for that. People won't be completely satisfied with that. If necessary, they'll be able to run on the escalation to $15 an hour, and maybe much more, maybe even a further escalation in 2022. So even that can be valuable. Terry Berg says, Senate confirms Rouse as Biden's top economist. Well, you mean as the chair of the Council, of Economic Advisors. I don't know that that's exactly Biden's top economist, because from a policy point of view, the top economist is probably the Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, or the chair of the National Economics Council, what's his name again? Kyle Reese, I forget. I just had it on my tongue earlier this evening. I quoted him. Senate confirms Rouse as Biden's top economist. That's actually Cecilia Rouse, chair of the Council, of Economic Advisors. Kay says, sad but true, Evelina. And Evelina says, makes me mad. And Stephen Day says, mad as hell. Kay says, me too, Evelina. I live here. Terry Burke says, will we ever beat COVID back enough in the U.S., Texas to end coronavirus restrictions? Governor of Texas he's crazy. Steve Gonzalez said she's a labor economist, dean of the Princeton University School of Public International Affairs. Yes, I know. El Gringo says it's going to take time to restore chaos. And Troy, that's what Gringo says, got to catapult the propaganda. Terry Burke says, more checks, yay, because COVID ain't going nowhere when you have idiots like Noam, Abbott, and Death Santis. Yes. Evelina says the federal job guarantee was such a good idea. You and anyone who wanted could work with good benefits, like Medicare for all, also in the package. Says exactly. Not sure I'm physically able to work anymore, but Medicare for all would definitely be a help. Right, a job guarantee would definitely be a help, because with a job guarantee, there are going to be a lot more jobs for disabled people. So you might well be able to work then. Terry says, the Voting Rights Act had a surprisingly good day at the Supreme Court here. I'm to read it on the web. Oh, well, that would be interesting. I'll be happy to read it. Terry says, isn't that the Booker Romney legislation? No, it's the Voting Rights Act. Oh, that's the previous Voting Rights Act. No, that Voting Rights Act That's the old Voting Rights Act that's up at the Supreme Court. It's the Voting Rights Act of what, 1964 and 1965. They were contesting what they were suing about in the Supreme Court today was Section 2. They're trying to overturn Section 2 of that act. Section 4 and 5 have already been rewritten by John Roberts. That's what he did earlier to that bill. Whether he's through butchering it, I don't know. Steve Gonzo says, anyway, no, I don't think it's the Booker Romney legislation. I'm not familiar with what legislation you're talking about there. Steve Gonzo says, COVIDiots. They come and go. They come and go. Right. Hashtag Ron Wright tweeted to open schools while secretly hospitalized, now dead. Hashtag COVID. Terry Burke, Manhattan DA getting closer and closer to Trump, like chompy jaws shark. All of that's in Smart News. To read it on the web, tap here. Steve says, well, France jailed ex-president for corruption. Yeah, Sarkozy. Let's hope it's a Trump. Yeah, that's amazing. That was amazing. And they jailed him for a cover-up. He tried to cover up. Steve Day says, what is a proper measuring stick on our economy? There's no single measuring stick, but basically people are trying to develop substitutes for the GDP. Other measures that take into account happiness and well-being and satisfaction. Kay says, good question, Steve Day. And Terry Burke says, evictions. Terry Burke says, how interesting, a cephalopod has passed a cognitive test, but designed for human children. That is interesting. And Steve says, in Jackson, Mississippi, the entire city has gone 2 weeks without water. Yes, I read about that too. Terry says, yeah, I saw that too. Steve says, we've got enough bottom feeders. Force big biz into wage increases with the competition. FJG will give them. Steve says, we've got enough bottom feeders. Terry says, does anyone happen to know if those 80 migrants from South America trapped in an oil tanker being smuggled through Texas were found? No, I don't know. Evelina says, speaking of IQ tests, brings back bad memories. I remember being in grammar school and taking that test, which was required back then. I answered a few questions, then got mad and decided not to answer anymore. Still scored above average on an incomplete test. Nuns didn't say anything. That surprised me more than anything. Bad memories. Kay says, haven't heard about that, Terry. Steve Day says, no excuses packed. And Kay says, Joe Manchin is a Kentucky bigot. I thought he was a West Virginia bigot. Terry says, wish we could hire hackers to let people in Arizona and West Virginia know what their POS senators is costing them. Kay says, the West Virginia I meant. Steve Day says, how to hack for dummies, smiles. Terry says, is that a manual? Is that a manual? Okay. And Elaine McForbes says, hi. Hello, Elaine. Steve Day says, I wish maybe Cliff Notes. I am kidding. Sorry. Terry says, Steve Day may be real progressives, okay, for action. Steve Day says that is real progress, okay, in action. Kay says, our revolution is working on many things too. Steve says, the disability tried to use a 154 score to deny, okay, my eligibility because I could fool them. I asked them if hearing voices counted if I couldn't understand them. They said, get out. No, I'm not saying that you would qualify as disabled, Steve. What I'm saying is that in the job guarantee, whether you're disabled or not, you can probably find a job that you can do without in any way declaring any kind of disability. Terry says, I can't believe that we still have to fight to be able to vote effortlessly. Well, it's the Republicans along about 1980 or 1981. They talked about getting away from goo citizenship. Yes, from being good citizens, the good citizen idea. And that, no, we don't want everybody voting because too many people are just ignorant and don't have the knowledge to vote. What we want to do is to limit the vote to as few voters as possible. Yeah, Paul Weyrich said that to a Republican convention, I believe, back in 1980 or 1981. He said the quiet part out loud 40 years ago now. Ever since then, the Republicans have been trying to disenfranchise as many people as possible. Evelina says conservative Supreme Court judges in many places are a problem right now in Europe and Latin America, not just in the United States. I know in Brazil, they're a big problem. The Supreme Court justices basically acquiesced in the jailing of Lula. That's what they did. Steve Day says, oops, C4 allowed to raise funds applied to direct lobbying by real progressives is the 501c. Yep, real progressives is the 501c, true. Or has applied for 501c anyway. Don't think they've got it yet. Steve Day says 3. Kay says, my Scott had a death sentence with terminal cancer, took over a year for him to be approved for disability, even with a lawyer, but he died 2 months before that kicked in. Shake my head. Social Security is way broken. It is, and that's another thing that he has to fix. Rule 22 is the Byrd rule. No, but Rule 22 is the filibuster rule. Part of it, okay, is the Byrd rule. But if you get rid of the filibuster, you get rid of Rule 22, including the Byrd rule. And Spain and Argentina are having a difficult time getting progressive laws passed and shady officials convicted. Terry Burke says neutralize Cinema, Manchin, and McConnell, and the filibuster will no longer be a problem. If the filibuster is there, it will be a problem. Other people will arise and will make it a problem. The filibuster has to go. Kay says, seems to be happening everywhere, Evelina. Also, if you get rid of the filibuster, then McConnell, Cinema, and Manchin will no longer be a problem because Cinema and Manchin will have to take floor votes on things that they in no way want to vote against, that they don't favor, but they don't want to be seen voting against. They'll talk about it in Congress. They'll take positions in the Senate. They'll be quite frank about it. But they don't want an ad saying they voted against it. Kay says, seems to be happening everywhere. Evelina says, it's a trend for sure. Kay says, I hated Evelina. Terry Burke says, even Facebook is fascist. L. Stephen Day says, Stephen Miller, ugh. Steve Gonzo says, I literally had to develop a substance abuse problem before I won. Now I drink, didn't before smoke, didn't before, and did 10 years of hard drugs. Only smoked cannabis before. And Terry says, Portland protesters being kidnapped was blatant fascism. Yes, it was. But it hadn't gotten to Nazism yet. Evelyn says, ha ha, they get rid of the filibuster first before touching these individuals, I think. Evelina did some icon that I can't read from this interface. Kay said, at least you aren't dead, Steve. I smoke too and have my nighttime beers. Steve says, chronic pain, broken neck, made it easy. Now I can't even get any meds because I refuse to give up cannabis or lie. Steve Day says, issue bootstraps. And Steve Guzzo says, C67. Don't know what that is. And Terry Burke says, Duck Dynasty Commandos hoarded the all on the 6th. Steve Day says, thank you, Bonnie. And Steve Gonzo says, you heard, that was at 10:54. And at 10:55, Steve Gonzo says, yeah, I heard they calling Ron Johnson QAnon Ron and Ron Anon. Laugh out loud. Ron Johnson, Ron Anon. Steve Day says, the January exception for lame duck POTUS. How can anyone truly think they are the chosen people in the 21st century? Such a backward thing. People can always think they're the chosen people. They just love to think they're the chosen people. Terry says, Fasco, Nazi movement skyrocketing, birth rates plummeting, The Handmaid's Tale is becoming ever more life immolating art. It's very clever, Terry. Life immolating art. Kay says March 4th is in a couple of days. Steve Day says and Terry Burke says Insurrection 2.0. Terry says under his eye. Evelina says why? In 80 years, 22nd century. Terry says corporate liberalism is why. Evelyn says, Terry Burke, I see it now. Corporate neoliberalism is why. Terry Burke says, I see it now. Kay says, threatened insurrection by some. Evelyn says, they didn't want to set a precedent by impeaching DT. Says a lot about their own motivations. Terry says, entitled white folks that feel a little hardship due to COVID turn Nazi without hesitation. Kay says, I'm starting to be really afraid to be an American these days. Mona says, a Twitter follower commented earlier that society seems to gate. And Terry says, no time to be scared, suit up. Okay, and Lana says, hate anyone disabled or other, which does remind me of Hitler's time. Yeah. Kay says, I'm old and afraid. And Lana says, other, sorry, typing too fast. Evelina says, but you represent what is good about being an American, Kay. Your values, I mean. And Terry Burke says, Gates is an incomprehensible threat, but people ignore it. Yeah, Gates is really an extreme guy. Kay says, thank you, Evelina Pont. Evelina Pont. No one listens to me anymore, though. We listen to you, Kay. Steve says, PC crashed, reboot. Steve Gunter says, seems like no one's listening to any of us. L. Stephen Day says, I get a drop in cell signal, and poof, I'm kicked out. Kay says, true, Steve. Steve Gonzo says, but by the way, who runs their kid over and dumps him in the Ohio River? God, I don't know. And Terry says, Gosner just went to a white nationalist rally, and he's still on Capitol Hill. L. Steve Day says, do tell. Steve Gonzo says, and by the way, what's happened to Wolfbrand? And sorry, I scroll down too fast. So Steve Gonzo links to something. I'm not sure what. Terry Burke says, begging for bipartisanship by Democrats constantly exposes their weakness in submission to the Nazi GOP. I know. Now, it is spelled McDonough, McDonoughh. It's McDonough, the old Scott spelling, McDonough. I forget her first name. Maybe it's Denise. No, I don't think it's Denise. I read it today. Steve Day says, Rokana. Evelina says, Ms. Deneau. Evelina says, Ms. Deneau, a damn thing. You mean? L. Steve Day says, hashtag the Biden record goes on. And Steve Gonzo says BS equals Bernie Sanders. P. Terry Burke says we need to organize an underground. Terry says I caught that. Steve Day says railroad. Terry Burke says McDonough. Terry Burke says of hackers. And Evelyn says Terry Burke sounds Irish. No. Oh, I don't know. I thought that Burke was an English name. No. And Terry says Evelina Ponte, I suppose. Steve Gonzo says Bernie equals controlled opposition. He certainly seems controlled now. Steve Wolfbrand says, you know, Doc, if you took a good magic mushroom trip, you wouldn't stutter anymore or be afraid of dying. Not that you are presently. No, thank you, Steve. Good magic mushroom. Terry says, that's kind of rude to say. Well, I don't care. That's all right. Kay says, eternal peace sounds pretty good to me. Shake my head. Not to me. Sorry, Kay. Man, Bonnie and I intend to live till we're at least 125. Terry Burke says, Bernie blows a lot of things. Steve Wolfbrand says, why? I'm trying to help. Steve Wolfbrand, stop pushing magic mushrooms. Laugh out loud. Evelina says, you still mad? Laugh out loud. Steve Day says, spoiled mavoots here, Steve. Good night. And Steve Gonzo says, try psilocybin, which I believe is magic mushroom, isn't it? Kay says, I would love to go to work if I could. I miss working. Steve Gonzo says, what job would you suggest for me under an FJG? I don't know, Steve, but there are lots of, I'm telling you, you could probably invent a job under the FJG, and you could probably put in an application to start a cooperative with other people on the FJG. And if you were doing something of local community value, you would probably get the salaries for that venture. That is, if we're able to pass an MMT style FJG, that's what would happen. Terry says you could do store runs for beer for all the other drinkers that don't want to go out tipsy. Evelina says part-time at something you love could be ideal, alas. Steve Wolfbrand says Paul Stame. Terry Burke says dog walker. Yeah, my brother works as a dog walker. Maybe you could get a job like that under the JG. I don't know how much he earns as a dog walker. Kay says, yes, it would, Evelina. Kay says, redneck GOP ruled Ohio is depressing as it is. Evelina says, junior high basketball coach part-time. Steve Wolfbrand fed Paul Stamides told Joe Rogan that after a psilocybin trip, he never stuttered. Well, it's possible I would never stutter either. So what? So what? I don't stutter that much now. Hashtag FJG, manna from heaven, says Terry Burke. Evelyn says, I would teach Spanish. Steve Wolfbrand said, start it again. So what? And Steve says, I will post it to the group. Steve Gonzo says, F a bunch of bootstrap of bitches.
What's that?
I don't know.
It's 29 degrees now.
Thank you. Kay says, come on back, Evelina Ponte. We need you here. Yes, Brazil. Best example of corrupt Supreme Court judges. See, instantly came into my head. It's Brazil. It's Brazil. But they're probably they're probably corrupt ones in Ecuador too, right, Evelina? And in Chile. Betcha. Anthony says, Anthony smiles. Terry Burke says, psycho mushrooms are bad for internal organs and probably other systems as well. Oh, you think so? I don't know. The Native Americans used to do a lot of magic mushrooms, which doesn't mean it wasn't bad for their internal organs, I suppose.
Smart people.
They were very smart about nature, as they were. Evelyn says, I teach English as a second language. It makes me feel useful. Actually, you are useful. Evelina says that that Moro, I believe, was the Brazilian Supreme Court judge who railroaded Lula into jail. Yes, he was. Lana says, which enabled Bolsonaro to win the presidency. If not for that, Bolsonaro would not have become the president, of Brazil. And a lot of grief would have been avoided. Lana says C6 and C7, cervical neck sections. Mine are 1, 4, and 5 per the chiropractor. Kay says, feeling useful is a good feeling. That is what I miss about working. Steve Gonzo says, C6 and 7 cervical vertebra. Evelina Pate says, I listen. What am I? Mincemeat? Laugh out loud. Steve Gonzo said, Steven Zoniger, Danziger, the bloodying the nose of a corporate. HTTPS, YouTube. Maybe he's talking about Nira. Evelina Pont says, oh, Scottish lass. Steve Wolfbrand said, I will share to Devora. Perhaps she can convince you. She can convince me about what? Taking magic mushrooms? Maybe she can. And maybe she doesn't think it's as big a problem as you think it is, Steve. Steve Gonzo says, Steve made Barney gasp. He did? And Kay says, if I still had a life, I would want to live longer too. My life has sucked bad for 5 years now. Well, maybe more Social Security will help that. It's about getting rid of the filibuster. I'm telling you. You want to get Social Security expansion too? It's about getting rid of the filibuster. Steve Gonzo says, hashtag MMT plus hashtag FJG equals all the things, just coaxing answers out of you, Dr. Joe. I'm all for hashtag MMT and hashtag FJG. For God's sakes, I wrote 7 books about MMT and its applications. Terry Burke says, be strong. There are many people who have it way worse than you. I know. Evelina says, in Argentina, too, corrupt judges put there by Macri. Yeah. And Terry Burke says, Steve DeVore did mushrooms and attributes his kidney issues to that history before he died. I didn't realize that. That's interesting to know. Kay says, I know, Terry, but I'm just over it. I did everything right and lost everything. Yeah. Sometimes I feel I did everything right too, except that maybe when I was in my 30s, I should have migrated to Canada. Evelyn said, exactly, Dr. Joe. Moro was truly that Moor on the coast in medieval Spain. Terry Burke says, Devore. Devore. Yeah, Steve Devore. Yeah. Lana says, if you take the magic mushrooms, I expect a video. Haha. Terry says, you're still living, able to walk and eat. It's hard, but it could be way worse. Steve says, Kay needs some magic mushrooms, seriously. Kay says, Terry, you can't understand. Evelina says, Amoro is Amor in Spanish. Can you believe it? Laugh out loud. Yeah, what's wrong with the Moors? I think the Moors did an awful lot for Spain when they were there, don't you? Terry Burke says, can't understand what, but wallowing. Steve Gonzalez says, you all are getting me through these times. Thanks. Less than 3, hashtag no filibuster or bust. Steve Wolfbrand says, too cold in Canada. Yeah, it's too cold.
It's 29 here.
But there's a hell of a lot better safety net. Kay says, I'm done, Terry. You can't understand. Oh, by the way, I just learned today that the deficit in Canada has increased from 25 billion to 450 billion due to COVID. This emerged, happened to be watching a video. It was a video appearance by Stephanie Kelton, okay, in front of an international group. I forget the name of the group, but it had a lot of extremely notable people in it, who are ambassadors to this and that. Steve Keen, okay, was part of the group too, but Stephanie was giving a presentation on the deficit myth, okay, to the group. And somebody from the group happened to mention, basically in support of Stephanie, I think it was Philippe by Brochan, mentioned that in Canada they had an increase, okay, from $25 billion to $450 billion, okay, in their deficit. And so Bonnie remarked and said, oh, 450 billion, that's not much. So I said, you have to remember that Canada has roughly 38 million people, not 330 million people. So we have 8.65 times the number of people Canada has. So a $450 billion deficit for Canada would be equal to roughly a $3.9 trillion deficit here. So our deficit for the last fiscal year was $3.1 trillion. So basically, on a per capita basis, we had a smaller deficit than Canada has had. So I thought that was interesting. Translated into the U.S. situation, if we had had the same level of deficit spending than Canada had, we would have had a $3.9 trillion deficit last year, as opposed to a $3.1 trillion deficit. Guess what a $3.9 trillion deficit would have funded if we had wanted to fund it that way? A federal job guarantee costs less than that $800 billion difference. Kay says, I'm done, Terry. You can't understand. And Terry Burke says, a denial ain't just a river in Egypt. And Steve Gonzo said, at Savage Joy, Marie won. My condolences to Neera Tanden for deleting over 1,000 egregious tweets for nothing. However, I'm sure there will be more to come. Lana says, gasp, Canada deficit. Lana says, gasp. Yeah. Kay says, Canada's corrupt too, from what I hear from people that live there. Yes, it is. Okay, it is corrupt, but there is Medicare for all, and there is a much stronger safety net, and they added to pass a basic income of $2,000 a month for all their people during the COVID crisis. So guess what? They ain't as corrupt as the United States. Evelyn says, actually, they did, Dr. Joe. The Moors civilized Spain. Can't tell most Spaniards that, though. Moors on the coast is an old refrain in Spanish, meant to be a warning, a little facetious, that's all. But everyone uses it. Moors on the coast, yeah. I know about the Moors in Spain. What they did in Spain is well known to Jews who have studied any history, of Judaism, because the Jews in Spain really flourished under the Moors. And it was a disaster for them when Christians completely reconquered Spain, because that was the start of the Inquisition and the forced expulsion of Jews from Spain, either forced expulsion or forced conversion. The Jews had a choice. So, interesting bit of history. Still waiting for those numbers. Moors taught Spaniards how to cook and bathe. Yes, they did. Steve Gonzo said, still waiting for those numbers, specifics, Joe. Which numbers specifics, Steve? Kay says, thank you all for another great discussion. Love these discussions and love you all too. I knew this was going to be a long one because I started out with 10 things to get through, so I knew it was going to be a long one. So anyway, you had a long one tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. There still are 11 of you here, so I think you did enjoy it. And Evelina says, they did. The Moors let Jews and others pretty much go about their business. Yeah, more than that, Jews were very highly valued in the Moorish courts. And there was one Jew who functioned as a physician in Spain, okay, and as a philosopher. Who was known as, his name was actually Moses Maimonides. And there's an old saying that says, from Moses onto Moses, there was no one like there goes my stutter again. But there was no one like Moses. That completes the sentence. So anyway, from Moses on to Moses, there was no one like Moses. See, I did that good. And he is the second most revered philosopher in Jewish history. Maybe the most revered philosopher in Jewish history. But if you look at it from a secular point of view, the most revered of the Jewish philosophers was probably Spinoza. Maybe. Evelina Pont says, Steve Gonzo says, numbered, laugh out loud. And Dolores says, thank you and good night all. Terry Burke says, good night, great stuff, good stuff, great stuff. Steve Gonzo said, he said something a while back about being able to sum it up in so many sentences. Sum up what? Lana says, my other comment just got deleted, very strange. And Evelina says, yes, Maimonides. Yes, otherwise known as Moses ben Maimon, if I recall correctly. Moses ben Maimon. Maimonides.
Good night.
Okay, I think Maimonides is in Greek. Evelina says, nothing like completing a sentence, I must say. Lana says, I will try again. Jews expelled around 1492, right around time of Christopher Columbus, or whatever his name really was. I think it was Cristobal Colon or something, wasn't it? Anyway, yes, in fact, there were supposedly some Jews on the Nina, the Pinta, or the Santa Maria. I think there were 3 Jews on one of those ships. Anyway, they took the opportunity to try to discover India. Try to go to India the wrong way around. They came to America instead. Yes, Jews were expelled around 1492. Yes, that was the year of the expulsion of the Jews. But it continued. It continued. And Evelina says, Espinoza, yes. Yes, his Spanish name was Espinoza. That's right. And what was his first name? Was Benedict. So what is that in Spanish, Evelina? Terry Burke says, hey, if the vino doesn't help the stuttering, shrooms won't either. I don't have a problem with your stuttering. It gives you extra flavor. Thank you, Terry.
Thank you.
Grateful for the extra flavor.
I just ignore it.
Doc, please watch the Joe Rogan video I will share to the group. It could help you and Bonnie. It's 2 hours. You watch in parts. Okay, please share the video. I'll be happy to watch the video. Steve Gonzo says, Joe laughing at himself. Priceless. I've had a lot of years to learn to laugh at myself, Steve.
I'm not promising to look at that for 2 hours.
And Bonnie's saying she's not promising to look at it for 2 hours. But Steve says you can watch it in parts. Of course, like you watch my videos in parts. There are lots of people who watch my videos in parts, right? Anyway, folks, this has been really delightful. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying. I think I'm going to say good night.
Good night.
And have myself a snack. And I'll see you tomorrow. Wednesday is another Joe Day. Hope you all shared this. I didn't ask you to share. I hope you shared as much as you could. Anyway, good night. And sleep tight.